All right, so the Senate has officially passed the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, the bill that was largely being pushed forward by Senator Joe Manchin, the millionaire coal baron from West Virginia. So I figured I would give you guys a little update on what was included in this bill, what was taken out of this bill, and basically how corporate Democrats formed a bipartisan coalition with Republicans to block essentially every single amendment that was added to this bill by Bernie Sanders. So here to start us off from Common Dreams, they say Sanders says Senate bill is nowhere near enough as Democrats and the GOP tank his amendments. So a little bit of details here. They say after his amendments to expand Medicare and strip out giveaways to the fossil fuel industry were defeated in near unanimous votes by Democrats and Republicans, Senator Bernie Sanders on Sunday supported the final passage of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, but said that it goes nowhere near far enough in addressing the problems facing struggling working families. So we're going to get to a lot more details on this bill, but just in like very general terms, it can be true that this bill in an overall sense is a net positive on a number of different things. There's definitely some provisions in this bill that I 100% support, but also it's 100% a fair criticism to say that it doesn't go nearly far enough on basically any of the different fronts, whether it's healthcare, the economy, or climate change that are, supposedly tackled in this bill. So they continue here with more details, saying that Sanders, the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, offered amendments that would have removed oil and gas handouts from the reconciliation bill. I think that this pretty much, if it had been included in this, which there was basically no chance of that happening, but if they had taken out the fossil fuel provisions within this bill, there's absolutely no way that Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, a bunch of other Democrats would have supported it. So while I am 100% against investing more so in the fossil fuel industry than we already are, still that was pretty much something that had to be included in this bill if you are accepting that Joe Manchin gets to dictate the parameters of what we're able to get passed through the Senate. So he's definitely right on a principled stance on opposing that, but in terms of like logistically getting a bill through the Senate right now, that probably was not going to be realistic. But they also said that he added an amendment to expand Medicare to cover dental, hearing, and vision, and they say also establish a civilian conservation corps, strengthen the measure's drug price provisions, and revive the expanded child tax credit, and hike the corporate tax rate. So keep in mind, all of these different amendments that Bernie Sanders introduced were things that basically every single Republican, even Joe Manchin on many of these things, said previously that they supported. Okay, so understand, this is a reconciliation bill. You only need 51 votes. So if these Democrats were actually telling the truth and saying that they supported a lot of these things, then you would have expected that they would have voted for these amendments. But no, the exact opposite of that happened. And if you get into some of the details here on the actual votes that took place on these various amendments, it's just like absolutely embarrassing. I mean, Bernie Sanders really was standing alone, and in some cases standing with like a handful or less than a handful of other Democrats on these amendments. So here from Warren Gunnels, one of Bernie's top advisors, he says our amendments, number one, to cut Medicare drug prices by 50%. That was voted down in a vote of 1 to 99. Okay, so again, bipartisan corruption here from Democrats and Republicans. Then you have the next one, which was to expand Medicare, and that was struck down 3 to 97. So again, overwhelming bipartisanship here, but they give a little bit more details on who was actually standing by Bernie on this one. They say the Vermont senator was the lone yes vote on all but one of his amendments, and the two senators who sided with him on this were both from my home state here in Georgia. Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff supported the proposal to expand Medicare. So I guess, somewhat credit to, my boys here in Georgia, but still pretty pathetic that the overwhelming majority of the Democratic caucus voted against an amendment to expand Medicare, something that, again, they all previously said that they support, and the overwhelming majority of the American people also support. But they continue with another amendment here, the Civilian Climate Corps. That was voted down 1 to 98. The extended child tax credit 1 to 97, something that even like Joe Manchin used to say that he supported. To strike the fossil fuel brakes, of course, voted down at 1 to 99. And Warren Gunnels finished off here by saying it always seems impossible until it's done, never give up. But it's hard not to have a doomer mindset when the vast majority of our, even Democratic supposed left-wing party here is voting against measures that they not only previously said that they support, but again, are overwhelmingly supported by their own constituents. And just to give that a little bit more, meat heat to that, or substance to exactly how out of touch the Senate is right now with the American people. So here from Austerity is Theft, he points out that on expanding Medicare to cover hearing, vision, and dental care. Okay, think about that just conceptually, all right? We're talking about having Medicare, one of the longest standing and most popular policies here in the United States. We're talking about expanding healthcare, okay, for seniors to be able to cover things like hearing, vision, and dental. Okay, so your teeth, your ears, your eyes. Last time I checked, those things are probably healthcare in some way, shape, or form. Call me a radical for suggesting that, but I think that your eyes, your ears, your teeth should be considered as part of healthcare coverage. But apparently, the overwhelming majority of both Democrats and Republicans disagreed with that. Even though, again, it is something that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people, even across party lines here. So. They say all likely voters, roughly 55% strongly support it, 28% somewhat support it. So this is, again, bipartisan, okay? This is not just like Democrats. This is all voters in the United States. And you have almost 80%, 83% who support this legislation, with only 11% opposed to this. And yet you had basically a complete reversal of that, if not an even greater reversal of that, with only 3% of the Senate deciding to vote for that measure and 97% of the Senate voting against that measure. Now, also keep in mind, there were a lot of excuses that were put forward by some corporate Democrats justifying why they wouldn't vote for these amendments. Basically, their justification was that, well, if we include these amendments, then this bill will likely fall apart in its entirety. People like Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, they're going to have more problems with it, and they're going to jump ship. But again, that argument pretty much just completely falls apart when you recognize that even people like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin have previously said that they support these types of provisions. So unless you're just saying that they're lying about that, unless you're saying that they're not actually negotiating in good faith, then there's no way you can make an argument that you shouldn't have included these provisions, because these are all things that are supported by the American people, and they're all things that you previously claimed were supported by the Democratic Party. But a little bit more context here on one of the most pathetic aspects of this bill and what was taken out of it. As pointed out here by CNN's Manu Raju, he says, in a 57-43 vote, the Democrats fall 3 votes short of the 60 votes needed to keep the provision in the bill. The $35 cap on insulin through private insurance has been removed, but the cap remains through Medicare. So one of the provisions that was within this bill was to basically across the board cap insulin prices for Americans at $35. Okay, now keep in mind some of the context here. First of all, okay, this 57-43 vote here, that wasn't even necessary. Okay, the only reason why Democrats even needed 60 votes for this measure is because they listened yet again to the completely all-powerful, almighty Senate parliamentarian who said that making a $35 cap on insulin, expanding that to the private sector, not just things that are covered under Medicare, the Senate parliamentarian said, whoops, you can't do that as part of the budget reconciliation process. And instead of doing what Republicans have done previously when the Senate parliamentarian tells them no, instead of doing things like either firing them, simply ignoring them, overriding them, any of those different tactics that Republicans have used to pass things like tax breaks for the rich, instead of doing any of that, they basically just gave deference to the Senate parliamentarian and decided to protect the sanctity of this position, this completely unelected bureaucrat just arbitrarily deciding what can be in these bills and what can't be. They decided to listen to her, and that's why they needed the 60 vote threshold instead of just the 51 vote threshold. So if they had just not listened to the Senate parliamentarian, they could have actually had the votes here in order to cap insulin at $35. But that's just on like the political maneuvering mistakes that Democrats made on this provision. If you actually get into more of the details in terms of how much Americans are paying for things like insulin or all prescription drugs, but this is a perfect case study example here, even that $35 cap that was being proposed, if you compare that to other OECD nations, other developed nations around the world, even that $35 cap, okay, you can't even see the end of this bar for what average Americans are paying right now. It's at like almost $100 right now for insulin. So it's literally off the charts here, off the screen in terms of what we're paying right now. But again, even if you look down here, the $35 that they were proposing would still have been what, like double or triple what most other OECD nations are paying for the same exact drug, a drug that costs like a couple of dollars to produce, that only costs this much because we are allowing these private corporations to profit off of people's suffering. I mean, just completely ridiculous situation. But again, even that $35 limit here, which would still be more than what every other OECD nation is paying, apparently that's still too far on that front. But now we get into a little bit of the climate funding that was a part of this. Now, Democrats are coming out and claiming that this is the biggest and most historic climate investment in U.S. history. That might be objectively true, but at the same time, I think that that's really making a point that we have not been doing it nearly far enough or nearly enough to actually invest in renewable energy or to combat climate change. I mean, it's not really saying anything if you're going to say that this is the most historic investment in climate change. Meanwhile, throughout modern history, we haven't really been doing anything to invest in climate change. It's like kind of the lowest bar you could possibly imagine on something that is probably the greatest threat to the United States and to the planet as we know it. But just for a point of comparison on this, I mean, as I said in my tweet there, if this is historic, if this is, a once in a generation investment in climate change, as Joe Biden and other Democrats are touting it to be, I mean, it's just fucking pathetic here. And, obviously it's a great metric to compare it to the military budget that we have here in the United States. But basically there's like $370 billion over the next 10 years in climate investments. Some of those are good. They're basically tax incentives to bolster the renewable energy market. But at the end of the day, I mean, we're talking about, $370 billion over 10 years, roughly $37 billion a year. Comparing that to our military budget, which is right now sitting at like $850 billion a year. I mean, when you look at shit like this, it just puts it into perspective how much of an absolute joke our government is, how deeply corrupt they are, because they don't even bat an eye when they're talking about passing or raising an $850 billion per year military budget. But then when it comes to something that is literally the greatest threat to civilization as we know it, this is what they're willing to cough up for it. I mean, it's a complete fucking joke. And this also doesn't even get to, the fact that the Pentagon is a financial black hole. They can't even pass an audit to tell us where a lot of this money is going. You want to talk about reducing inflation, you want to talk about reducing the debt and the deficit. This is where I would be starting off, not by pushing austerity on working people and reducing investments in climate change, but I mean, at the end of the day, probably the best way that I could characterize the climate portion of this bill is basically, in the words of Joe Manchin himself, it's letting the market dictate how we are going to address climate change, okay? The same exact capitalist marketplace that has allowed fossil fuel corporations to profit off of the death and destruction of the planet for decades right now, while they actively lie to the public, lie to the government about the impacts of fossil fuels on the climate. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it obviously doesn't go nearly far enough in terms of like relative expenditure in what we're spending our money on within the United States. But in addition to that, I mean, again, this amount of investment in climate change is not going to go nearly far enough in transitioning us away from fossil fuels, because, if ExxonMobil and Chevron and Joe Manchin, who has personal ties to the fossil fuel industry, if they're celebrating this bill, it's not going nearly far enough to confront that industry and to confront the capitalist system that, pushes this incessant need for endless growth models that are completely incompatible with a sustainable planet, continues to gobble up all of the resources in every corner of the globe at the expense of people all across the world. So, I mean, there's no way that you could possibly make an argument that capitalism is going to be able to meaningfully address climate change. But that's basically the rundown of the climate portions of this bill. Some good investments, but also dramatically inadequate, because you're letting the capitalist marketplace decide how we are going to tackle this issue, when what you really need to be doing is confronting the capitalist marketplace and the destruction that a lot of these fossil fuel corporations have been causing to the planet. But instead of doing that, they're basically just giving them handouts and easing the transition towards renewable energy. But they continue here with a quote from Bernie Sanders and how he was characterizing this entire bill. So I wanted to read a little bit of that. They say, quote, "At a time when we face the existential crisis of climate change, the most significant part of this bill is an unprecedented $300 billion investment in clean and energy efficiency, including a $7 billion solar rooftop proposal that I introduced. And this bill could help increase U.S. solar energy by 500% and more than double wind energy by 2035. That is no small thing, but of course it's important to note here that according to Joe Manchin and how he structured this bill, basically every investment in renewable energies that we are making has to be offset or pre-offset by investments in fossil fuels that are equal or greater than that. So, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're simultaneously investing in renewable energy and fossil fuels, then you're not doing what the scientists are saying. What the scientists are saying is that we have to stop all fossil fuel investments right now in order to achieve the goals to prevent a lot of the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. So, again, some investments here, but doesn't even go nearly far enough, as he was saying there. But he continued saying that this bill also begins the work of making the wealthy and large corporations pay their fair share in taxes by imposing a 15% minimum tax on corporations. Keep in mind, even under the 2017 tax cuts under Donald Trump, where 83% of the benefits went to the top 1% of the American people, even in the wake of that tax cut, the corporate tax rate is supposed to be at 21%. So a 15% minimum tax on billion-dollar corporations is like only barely getting them slightly above halfway to what they're supposed to be paying according to the federal law right now. So they're already not paying their taxes. We know that a lot of these corporations, especially ones on the Fortune 500 list, very frequently pay literally $0 in taxes. So again, it's like this is a provision that's something, but it's not even remotely going far enough, not only to get us up to the 21% of what they're supposed to be paying under the current law, not even to mention getting us back to what the corporate tax rate was under Obama at roughly 35%. So again, something, but not nearly far enough. But they continue saying it also gives the IRS the resources they need to pursue the estimated $1 trillion in taxes not paid by the wealthiest people in this country, and will help ordinary working people get their returns faster. So there's been a lot of pushback here from Republicans saying that this IRS enforcement is only going to be waged against working class people and middle income people. But I don't necessarily think that that's true. I think that in a net way, this IRS bolster in the amount of people that they're hiring and the funding that they have is going to be a positive thing, and it will allow them to have a greater capacity to go after some of the biggest financial criminals in the country on Wall Street. So I think that that's actually a good provision in here, but they continue saying that this legislation also takes a small step in dealing with the outrageous prices of prescription drugs. Finally, we are giving Medicare the power to directly negotiate prescription drugs with manufacturers on behalf of beneficiaries. And he says, unfortunately, that provision does not kick in until 2026 and starts only with 10 drugs. Okay, so keep in mind, again, something that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people, having Medicare negotiate drug costs. Okay, again, think about that just conceptually. Before this, okay, our government didn't even have the ability to negotiate any of the drugs that we're purchasing. Okay, this is why Americans pay like 10x what other developed countries pay for, is because we are completely cucked and beholden to the interests of these for-profit billion-dollar big pharma corporations. So, at the end of the day, again, does something, but you're talking about 10 drugs by 2026 when they're going to start the negotiation process, leaving a wide gap, a window for Republicans, if they take back power, to completely undercut this provision. But in addition to that, why are you only doing it for 10 drugs? Why not every single drug across the board? Why is it starting in 2026? Why is it not starting right now? And, there's so many other drugs that will not be encompassed in this, where people are still going to have to be paying ridiculous costs out of pocket. So, again, a situation where it's like a tiny, mild step in the right direction, and Democrats are celebrating it as if it's like, the biggest achievement throughout all of human history. But they finish off here with a little bit of context in terms of what's next. They say the bill is expected to clear the House this week, securing a legislative win for the Democratic Party after a year and a half of negotiations that were repeatedly derailed by Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, corporate-funded lawmakers who were able to dictate the scope of the final package. And they say the West Virginia Democrat delivered significant handouts to fossil fuel giants, which helped bankroll his campaigns, while Sinema shielded the private equity industry's ability to avoid taxes. So I talked about this in my video a couple of days ago about Kyrsten Sinema getting her hands on this. She did end up successfully protecting these private equity ghouls on Wall Street from the tax that was supposed to be introduced by Manchin. But at the end of the day, I think that they kind of introduced that as a poison pill of some sorts, or knowing that she was going to exclude this from the package. So in a net way, again, you have some good investments there, but think about what was lost in this bill. All of those different things that we just said. We also had, as pointed out by Sahil Kapoor here, some of the other casualties of the Build Back Better agenda, including things like universal pre-K, child care money, elder care money, the child tax credit, housing money, community college, the EITC expansion, closing the Medicaid gap, immigration, tax rate hikes, millionaire surtax, ending the carried interest loophole. These items were excluded from the new bill. So, again, listen, in a broad calculus way, this is a net positive in terms of you're doing something to begin the process of addressing climate change. You're doing something to begin the process of allowing the government to negotiate some prescription drug costs. You're beginning the process on a number of different fronts, but at the end of the day, it doesn't go nearly far enough on any of those fronts, whether it's climate change, healthcare, the economy, etc. And I think that the main story here is not on like this being Biden's big grand accomplishment that's going to bolster significantly Democrats' chance in the midterms. It could have some impact, but instead of portraying this as like FDR 2.0 as a situation, this really should be recognized as what it is, and that is, a millionaire coal baron from West Virginia and a completely corrupted senator from Arizona having the ability to basically tank the majority of the president's agenda with little to no pushback whatsoever, and allowing, again, a fossil fuel millionaire to dictate the parameters of what we are doing in investing in climate change, the single greatest threat to the planet.